All right, so we're going to start talking about the neural tissue or nervous tissue. That's chapter 12. It's the heaviest chapter in this next unit. There's a lot of physiology in it, so we're going to go over just some basic anatomy and histology today and just a little bit of physiology, and then we'll save most of it for next week. Okay? All right, so chapter 12, this is just kind of a concept map so you can see what we're going to be looking at. We're definitely going over the organization of the nervous system, so we're going to look at anatomical and functional organization. We're going to go over the neuron and look at different parts of the neuron. We're going to talk about different types of neurons. And then we're going to talk about types of neuroglia. Neuroglia are the support cells that support the neurons. So we're going to talk about all of those things, and then we'll probably just start touching on the transmembrane potential so that we can start wrapping our brain around that, but we'll do most of that talking about the resting membrane potential, graded potential, action potential. We'll talk about most of those next Monday. Okay? Then at the end, we're going to talk about synapses, and you already have seen a synapse. That's what happens at that neuromuscular junction. When acetylcholine gets released from the neuron, binds to that motor end plate, that's a synapse. Then it starts another action potential in the muscle. That's a synapse. So we'll be talking about that too. Chapter 12, the nervous system. If we want to look at the nervous system and divide it into, or classify it as structural, we would say that the brain and the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. So those two things are part of the central nervous system. Okay? Anything that extends off of the brain or off of the spinal cord, that's going to be part of the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is going to include these neurons from going into the brain, and we call those cranial nerves. And neurons going into the spinal cord, and we call those spinal nerves. Okay? Now, if those cranial nerves and spinal nerves are carrying information into the spinal cord or into the brain, we say those are sensory neurons. They contain sensory neurons because they're bringing information into the brain or into the spinal cord. So those nerves, the neurons in those nerves would be considered sensory neurons. Right? But if the neurons were carrying a command out of the spinal cord, either from the brain or from the spinal cord, we would say those are motor neurons. So motor neurons carry motor commands. What are they going to carry motor commands to? They're going to carry motor commands to effectors. Effectors are things in your body that can respond and can do something. So effectors can be glands, because if the nervous system tells your glands to do something, they're going to secrete. They're going to secrete mucus or sweat or saliva or oil, or, they're going to secrete something. An effector can also be the heart, so cardiac muscle. An effector can be smooth muscle, and it can also be skeletal muscle. So all the muscles can be effectors. Okay. Even adipose tissue can be an effector. So those are the effectors that the brain is telling to do something. They're going to respond. Those sensory neurons, they're receiving information from receptors. So the receptors are saying, you know, something's changed. I need to let the brain know about this. So it might send the information into the spinal cord, and from there, another neuron will carry it up to the brain, or it'll go directly into the brain through cranial nerves. Right? So we said anatomically we have the peripheral nervous system, which are the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves, and then we said we have the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And then these other things, when I'm talking about receptors and sensory neurons and motor neurons and effectors, that's how we classify the nervous system as functional. That's how we explain it in its functional sense. Right? And to classify this, any information that's going into the brain, that's going to be part of the afferent nervous system, or afferent division. And anything that is leaving the spinal cord, that is part of the efferent division, or the efferent nervous system. So you can think of it this way. A in afferent means arriving. So any information, if it's arriving at the central nervous system, we call it afferent. And then E in efferent, if it exits the central nervous system, that's part of the efferent division. Okay. So the efferent division sends out motor commands. The afferent division is bringing in sensory information. Okay? Now, when we start talking about this efferent division, where the brain and the spinal cord are working together to send out motor commands to these effectors, once we start looking at that, so we're looking at the efferent division. And again, that's where the brain is sending out motor commands. If those motor commands are going to skeletal muscle, we say it's part of the somatic nervous system. If those motor commands are going out to those other receptors, so the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, adipose tissue, or glands, those are all part of the autonomic nervous system. Okay. So the efferent division can either be somatic or autonomic. And it really just depends on what's the effector. That'll tell you if it's somatic or autonomic. All right, so now we're going to look at the neuron. So a neuron is like an electrical wire. It's going to transmit electrical impulses. That's what it does, basically. So we're going to talk about that too. We're going to talk about those electrical impulses, or those ions that create these action potentials. But first, let's look at a typical neuron. So this is a multipolar neuron. And we'll talk about the different types of neurons, but just so you understand, this is a multipolar neuron. Right? So multipolar neurons are always going to be motor neurons. So what do motor neurons do? They send commands out to effectors, right? Yep. So that's what a motor neuron does. So let's look at all the different parts of these neurons. So first of all, we've got the cell body. So that's just like any other cell that we have. We look inside the cell body and we can see that there's a nucleus. So that tells us that that cell can produce proteins. And it does. It's going to produce a lot of proteins that are called neurotransmitters. And then the endoplasmic reticulum, you see the rough endoplasmic reticulum there with all those ribosomes attached to it, right? So we've got a bunch of those. That is the rough ER, the rough endoplasmic reticulum. They're going to modify those proteins and help to package them up. And those proteins are going to get packaged up in these vesicles. And those vesicles are going to travel down this part of the neuron, and then they're going to be stored in the end of the neuron here that we call the synaptic terminal or the axon terminal. So I'm getting ahead of myself here a little bit, so let's go over some of the other parts. So we have the nucleus that makes a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter that we've already talked about at the neuromuscular junction is what?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
The neurotransmitter that we've talked about at the neuromuscular junction is what? ACH, right. Okay, so that nucleus is busy making ACH or other neurotransmitters if that's what that neuron is supposed to be making, bundling them up in a vesicle and sending them down to the axon terminal. Okay. Okay, so the one thing that this neuron does not have, however, are those little centrioles. There are no centrioles. And what does that mean then for that neuron? Yeah, they can't go through no mitosis. They can't go through mitosis. That means that none of the neurons that you have in the body are able to divide and create new neurons. Right? So they can't go through mitosis. So when we're looking at the cell body and looking at these rough endoplasmic reticulum, all those little ribosomes that are in there, they give the cell body a gray appearance. They look gray in appearance. So wherever you have, you've heard of gray matter, wherever you have gray matter in your nervous system, and we're going to see where it is in the spinal cord and where it is in the brain, wherever you have gray matter, that means there's a lot of cell bodies there that are giving it that grayish color. Okay? Sticking off, coming off of the cell body, we have these extensions here. All of these extensions. And all of those extensions are called dendrites. Dendrites are sensitive to stimulus. They're sensitive. They're sensitive to all sorts of stimuli. They're sensitive to bending, if something bends the dendrites, like touch. Okay? They're sensitive to chemicals, like acetylcholine. Right? So they're sensitive to voltage changes. So they're sensitive to a lot of different things. And they are what will help to stimulate that neuron. Right? Then we have, if we look at the cell body, we see that the cell body starts to come to at one point, we see one extension, and then as it starts to narrow down and funnel down, that area that acts as a funnel is called the axon hillock. Okay, that's the axon hillock. And the axon hillock then leads into this part of the neuron, which is called the axon. That's the axon. And we even give that very first segment of the axon a name. And we call it the initial segment. It's called the initial segment. Now, sometimes the axon can divide off into collateral axons, but all of the axons are going to end at a certain point, and the axon ends at an expanded area here. Each one of these, you can see that it expands, and those areas are called the axon terminal, or we can call it the synaptic terminal. Okay. And then this space in here looks a little familiar. That's the synaptic cleft. So that's where ACH would travel across and bind to a receptor on the other cell, right? So sometimes this second cell is going to be the muscle, and then this would be the neuromuscular junction, but sometimes it's another neuron. Maybe it's a gland. Maybe it's a smooth muscle. Maybe it's a cardiac muscle. We don't know. It's going to be either another neuron or it's going to be an effector. And so what we're going to do is name these then. We'll name the neuron that's sending the signal the presynaptic neuron, and we'll call the neuron that's receiving the signal, or the cell that's receiving the signal, the postsynaptic cell. Okay? Because what's happening here in this synaptic cleft area, that's a synapse. So presynaptic is what the neuron that's going to be sending the information. The postsynaptic cell is going to be the cell that's receiving the information. It can be another neuron, it could be a muscle cell, it could be a gland, it could be an adipose cell. Okay. So you need to know all those different parts on a multipolar neuron, and we're going to see other types of cells now, other types of neurons that are going to have these same parts, but they're going to look a lot different because they are functionally different. This cell is a multipolar neuron, so it's sending motor commands out to an effector, right? But we have sensory neurons that are bringing information into the nervous system. So now we're going to look at the different types of neurons. So here we see 4 different types of neurons. Which is the one that's the multipolar neuron? The one where? Furthest to your right. So this one is our multipolar neuron. Most multipolar neurons are motor neurons. Okay, they're motor neurons. They've got all the parts that we just talked about. But sometimes that cell body, it's not in between the dendrites and the axon. Here we can see, we call it, let me explain here, we call it multipolar because it has many poles sticking off of the cell body. Many poles. It has all these dendrites sticking off of the cell body, plus it has the axon. Multiple poles, so multipolar. That's why we call it multipolar. Okay? Now this one right here, this is the cell body right there. And we see one little pole sticking off of it. So what do you think we call that neuron? That's a unipolar neuron. Uni means one, polar. So there's one pole sticking off of that cell body. Okay. With a unipolar neuron, most unipolar neurons are your sensory neurons. So those are the neurons that are bringing sensory information into the central nervous system. It's going to tell your brain about pain, temperature changes, vibration, any sensation. So where are the dendrites? Well, the dendrites are here at this end. These are dendritic branches. Then we have our dendrite right there. So we have one big dendrite that the dendritic branches are merging into. And on this side of the cell body, we have the axon. And then down here, we have those axon terminals. So those are sensory neurons. The next type of neuron over here we see the cell body, and we have two poles coming off of the cell body. What do you think we call that? Right, bipolar. 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 Bi means two, so it has two poles. On this one, this is your dendrite on this side with all the little dendritic branches leading into it. And on this side, you have your axon. And at the ends here, those are your synaptic terminals or your axon terminals. So the bipolar neurons, we're not going to talk much about those, but we are going to see those. We see those, they're rare, but we see them like in your eye and in your nose. So we see them for seeing and smelling. So they're just in special areas. Now this last cell that we see a whole bunch of poles coming off of it, and one of those is an axon. Can you tell which one's the axon? No. You really can't. So what we say, one of those is an axon, but we can't see. This one will be called an anaxonic. An means without an axon. There is an axon, we just can't tell which one it is. So it's anaxonic. And it's going to be found in the central nervous system. So it'll be found in the brain and the spinal cord. And it's used to send information very short distances. Some of these other neurons, your sensory neurons, your motor neurons, they can be quite long. So you can feel things on the tip of your big toe, your great toe, right? So that sensory neuron goes the length of from your great toe all the way up to your spinal cord. That is a long neuron without synapsing, right? And the motor neuron going out to the muscle of your big toe so that you can lift your big toe up, that's just as long. Okay, so those neurons are going to be really long. These other neurons, these bipolar and anaxonic, they're going to be really short. The next thing we're going to talk about are these cells that are called neuroglia. Neuroglia. So neuroglia, I always say that the neuroglia is like the support staff to the neurons. They're going to get the neurons whatever they need. Do they need to be protected? Do they need, they just protect them, I guess, basically, and maintain them. So I'm going to go over the different types of neuroglia we have on this picture. And first we're going to talk about the neuroglia in the central nervous system. So the neuroglia in the central nervous system are going to be different than the neuroglia in the peripheral nervous system. Okay. So let's look at, this is the neuron, so we can see, here's our neuron right here, here's another neuron. This is the axon where the electrical impulses are going to travel down, right? All right, so let's start by looking at this cell right here. This cell has a really cool name. It is called the oligodendrocyte. Oligodendrocyte. And in the central nervous system, so in the brain and in the spinal cord, this oligodendrocyte makes myelin. Myelin is a fatty substance. It's fatty. So myelin is this fatty substance, and so fat always looks a little yellow, and so it makes this myelin, and the myelin covers part of that axon. So it covers up the axon. So wherever myelin is covering up the axon, nothing can go in or out of the axon, meaning things like sodium. Sodium would like to go into that axon. Where it's myelinated, it cannot. Where the axon is bare, sodium can get in. Okay? That's going to be important for us for later. We'll talk about that later. So that's what the oligodendrocyte does. It makes myelin, this fat. It's kind of a waxy, fatty substance. Then we have this other cell down here, and this cell is huge. It's got these long extensions coming off of it. And this cell we call the astrocyte. And the astrocyte creates a barrier between the blood and the brain, so the blood and the neurons, and we call that the blood-brain barrier. Blood-brain barrier. So this right here is a blood vessel. And we can see that this astrocyte has extensions that are called like these little feet. And the feet are covering the top of that blood vessel. It's surrounding it. So whatever is inside that blood vessel can't get out, can't get into the brain tissue, can't get into the spinal cord tissue. that's good because sometimes inside that blood we have things like bacteria, right? So we don't want things leaving the blood and getting into the brain. Not that many antibiotics can leave the blood and get into the brain. Yes?
Is the astrocyte the purple part that you have highlighted?
So this is the blood vessel right here.
Okay.
And then this part this is the actual astrocyte.
Okay.
And here's the extensions, and here's its like feet that surround the blood vessel. We can see that it's also connected to the neurons, so it stays in place. So it's creating this blood-brain barrier. So things can't get out of the blood and damage your brain. Right? Okay, then we have, if we look, so first of all, I'd like to tell you here that you see this line going across here? That's just determining the border between gray matter and white matter, right? So in white matter, in your brain and your spinal cord, the white matter is going to consist of these myelinated axons. Right? All of these axons that have myelin surrounding it, we say those are myelinated axons. And because they're surrounded by myelin, myelin has a yellowy, whitish color, then that neural tissue is going to look white. So we call it white matter. And then on the other side, we see gray matter, and what did we say gray matter was made up of? Right, it's made up of the cell bodies, because the cell bodies have those ribosomes and those rough endoplasmic reticulum that have a grayish appearance. And by the way, those ribosomes and the rough endoplasmic reticulum together, we call those Nissl bodies. So it's Nissl bodies that make the cell bodies gray. Okay, so one of the cells, the neuroglia that we see up here, is this one right here. And it's got all of these little extensions that look like little feathers. That is called a microglia. Microglia. A microglia is a tiny little macrophage. What does a macrophage do? What does any phagocytic cell do? It eats things. Eats things that don't look right. Eats bacteria. Eats old cells, eats debris, eats anything that doesn't look right. So the microglia are the cells, the phagocytic cells in the central nervous system. Okay. Then the last type of cell, the last type of neuroglia in the central nervous system that I want to talk to you about is going to, it is found surrounding the central canal of the spinal cord. So your spinal cord leaves the brainstem, it goes down through your spine, and the very center of the spinal cord is a tunnel. And that tunnel is called the central canal. And lining that tunnel are these cells that we call ependymal cells. Ependymal cells. Ependymal cells. They're also found inside the ventricles in your brain, which are cavities inside your brain. So they're found in there too. And the ependymal cells secrete a fluid that we call cerebral spinal fluid. Cerebral spinal fluid. Or we can shorten that up to CSF. That's what the ependymal cells produce, cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, so those are all of the neuroglia that we see in the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, and again, peripheral nervous system is cranial nerves and spinal nerves. Okay, so they're extending off of the brain and off of the spinal cord, so they don't have any of those neuroglia. They have their own special type of neuroglia. There's two of them. There's a satellite cell that helps to repair peripheral nerves. And so that would be sitting outside the cell somewhere. That would be like a satellite cell. And it repairs the neuron. But then there's another type of cell that's called a Schwann cell. And a Schwann cell is just like that oligodendrocyte. It's going to make myelin. But what it does is, like here's a Schwann cell, it just creates layers and layers and layers of myelin on that little segment of axon. And then here's another Schwann cell, and here's its nucleus. Here's another Schwann cell, and here's its nucleus. Here's another Schwann cell, and here is its nucleus. So it's making layers of myelin in these short little segments on a peripheral nerve, a peripheral neuron. Okay. So when it does this, this segment that it makes, that segment of myelin, that segment of myelin is called an internode. Internode. And then where the axon is bare and you don't have myelin, we call that segment the node. So we have the internodes and we have the nodes. And in your lab list, I think it still says node of Ranvier, because that's the name of the scientist that discovered it. But I think now we're just going by node. Okay? Any questions? Okay, that's enough for today, right?